Oh yeah, so yesterday, I know it was just a little detail that was concerning me, that in two places where I thought he should have used the word mishpatim when talking about laws that appeal to the intellect, he used the word mitzvot. I did look it up, and in the Hebrew, it also does use the word mitzvot. In the notes, he cited a Gemara as a source for it, and the Gemara uses the word mishpatim, but he is staying true to the translation, which again, the Shmoneh Perakim is written in Arabic and then translated into Hebrew, but the Rambam wrote it when he was young, because he's writing this at the time when he's writing his commentary on the Mishnah, which he's doing very young, like in his 20s. And so this translation is happening clearly when the Rambam is around, and the Rambam gets to see the translation. So you have to assume that it is vetted by the Rambam. Also, I saw that in, one second. There is this is in Genesis. This is in the Torah portion of Toldos. It says, Eikav asher shama Avram bekoli, because Avram listened to my voice, v'yishmor mishmarti, and he kept, or he guarded my guardings, mitzvotai, chukotai, v'torotai. So over here, it uses mitzvah and chok. It juxtaposes mitzvah and chok. And Rashi quotes, mitzvot, dvarim she'ilu lo nichtavu, re'uyin hem lihistavot, kamon gezel u'shvichas damim. So Rashi over here is quoting the very same thing they say about mishpatim in the Gemara that he cites on the bottom. Rashi says the word mitzvah is, if he hadn't written them, we would have said they should have been commanded. And chukot, exactly, in other words, what Rashi says here seems to be a paraphrasing of the Gemara in that he had quoted, that distinguished between chukim and mishpatim, maybe in Yuma, the Gemara. Anyways, the Rambam does seem to have basis for it. It's just that, so I'm no longer concerned. That's all I wanted to say. I'm not concerned that he misquoted. It just was weird that they're citing the Gemara, which uses the word mishpatim for that and not mitzvot. But the Rambam does use the word mitzvah, and there is another place where the word mitzvah is used, not mishpat. And you see over there Rashi quoting the very same Gemara, having no problem with interchanging mitzvah and mishpat. So I am once again not concerned about it. I don't know why, but since he's a rabbi from 1912, I don't know of him, and therefore the translation looked like it was well done, and it looked like he put a lot of effort into it, and that he really is trying to do a good job of translating it. And it was because of that I was comfortable sort of learning with this translation. But then if I saw something that suddenly made me call that into question, that's why it took me for a little bit of a loop, but it shouldn't have, because he did a good job, and I'm the one who needed to be schooled on that one. Okay, we are now going back. New chapter. So last chapter, he talked about how working on your character is necessary, even if you have perfect actions, even if at the end of your life you always had perfect actions, you would have been better off with a better character. That a person with good character and perfect actions is on a higher level than a person with perfect actions but not perfect character. So therefore, you should always be working on your character, always be working on bettering it. And he just brought up a potential question. There seem to be a lot of places in the Gemara and other Chazals that seem to suggest in the Mishnah, in Pirkei Avos, where it says Lafum Tzara Agra, the reward is according to the suffering, and in other places which make it sound like if you had to struggle in order to do the right thing, you get more reward than somebody who didn't struggle to do the right thing. Wouldn't that imply, therefore, that you actually get rewarded for not having great character? And then he explained that there's two kinds of struggles. When you're struggling with something that's considered a normal thing to struggle for, like you're struggling for some kind of pleasure that everybody considers a normal, healthy pleasure. but you're being told that it's wrong to do it. So let's say cheeseburger. I mean, unless somebody's commenting on the fat content, but if somebody has a cheeseburger, I think in most of the world, they would not consider that a moral issue. Again, there might be vegetarians who are concerned about the meat, but for the most part, they would not consider it a moral issue. But we are forbidden to eat a cheeseburger. So if somebody says, I would love to eat a cheeseburger, but what could I do? God told me not to. That's actually the highest form of observance of that mitzvah, because it is considered to be normal to want to eat it, but you're not eating it because of principle, because God told you not to eat it. But if a person said, I want to kill people, but I don't, that is not, you're not going to get extra reward for that. That you need to be working on that character trait. Why is it that you want to kill people? That's not good. And therefore you need to dial that back somehow. So that's the distinction he makes. And that's what he says whenever you see a quote in rabbinic sources that indicate that it would have been better to struggle than not to struggle. They're talking about a kind of normal desire, but not something which is considered a unhealthy desire. Okay, new subject. We've had some of this discussion already in the Rambam's codes, and when we talked about prophecy there, and now we're going to have some more discussion of prophecy here. It is one of the subjects that he keeps on coming back to. We're going to see it in a lot of the different texts that he talks about. Part of the reason he's doing it is because he really doesn't think there is a thorough treatment of this topic somewhere, and he wants to provide it. So in different places, he does that. Many passages are found in the Medrash, the Haggadah, and also the Talmud. Now, he doesn't mean the Haggadah for Passover. He means Aggadic works. And the Talmud, which state that some of the prophets beheld God from behind many barriers, and some from behind only a few, according to the proximity of the prophet to him, to God, and the degree of his or her prophetic power. Consequently, the rabbi said that Moses, our teacher, saw God from behind a single clear, that is transparent partition. As they express it, he, Moshe, looked through a translucent specularia. Specularia is the name of a mirror made from some transparent body like crystal or glass, as explained at the end of the tractate Kalim. So that's a tractate that has to do with purity and impurity. It's an enormous tractate, 30 chapters. So usually the way it's characterized is he sees through a pane of glass. So he's looking, when he looks at God, he looks as if through a pane of glass. Let me now explain the above statement. in accordance with what we have made clear in chapter 2, virtues are either intellectual or moral. Similarly, vices are intellectual, like ignorance, stupidity, want of understanding. I guess he has distinctions between what is ignorance, what is stupid, and what is want of understanding. Or they are moral, as inordinate lust, pride, irascibility, anger, impudence, avarice, and many other similar defects, a list of which we've given and explained in chapter 4. Each of these defects is as a partition separating man from God the Most High. This is what the prophet meant when he said, "But your iniquities have ever made a separation between you and your God," which means that our sins, which is, as we have said, are the let's try this again. That our sins, which, as we have said, are the evil qualities, are the partitions which separate us from God. We're having more Alaveda. Yesterday, we looked at the meaning of the word to know, da'at. And Rabbi Foreman suggested that da'at was gathering of information together with experience. So this is how because the earliest usage of the word da'at were man knew Adam and Chava, which is a kind of experiential connection, but also, and God knows that you will know. So there it seems to be gathering data about the world to inform him. So if you put them together, he wanted to suggest that da'at is a way of understanding that is via experience, like the rationalists and the okay. So we had, what does it mean to know? And now we're going to talk about, he's talking about eating from the tree of the Garden of Eden. And so he's going to be talking about, it's called the tree of knowledge of good and evil, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So he explained knowing, da'at, and now he wants to explain tov v'ra, good and bad.
Hi everybody, Rabbi David Foreman. We're back. We've been talking about analyzing the tree of knowledge of good and evil. In our last session together, we spent a lot of time talking about the word dat, or the word knowledge in Hebrew. And today, I want to try to clarify the other part of this, the phrase good and evil, or in Hebrew, the words tov and ra. These words are familiar to us from childhood, good and evil and tov and ra, and yet they're a little bit slippery. So let's try to understand what they mean, at least how the Bible uses them. So I want to come back to Maimonides. I mentioned to you before that Maimonides, medieval Jewish scholar from Spain, later moves to Egypt, that in the beginning of his monumental work, the Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide to the Perplexed, he talks about the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And he mentions that a fellow had asked him, didn't people gain something by eating from this tree? I mean, even if they were punished, but still, at least they had this knowledge of good and evil, and isn't that a good thing? Maimonides said, no, it's actually not a good thing. They actually didn't gain anything. They lost. Their vision actually became clouded by understanding good and evil. And this gets back to a point which we mentioned earlier. If you recall, at the very beginning, we had what we called this great big elephant in the room question. And that was, how could God punish mankind from eating from this tree of good and evil if they didn't have a knowledge of good and evil before they ate from the tree. I mean, if they didn't understand good and evil, so they couldn't have known what they were doing was wrong. If they didn't know what they were doing was wrong, then there's no justification for punishing them. So if you remember that question, the Rambam Maimonides has an answer to that question, and Maimonides' answer is this. Give them a knowledge of good and evil when they didn't have it before. Instead, what the tree did is it transformed their moral knowledge from one kind of thing into another. There is a pre-tree kind of moral knowledge and a post-tree kind of moral knowledge. What does morality look like in the pre-tree world, and what does it look like in the post-tree world? So this, again, is today's $64,000 question. We do know what the post-tree world looks like. In the post-tree world, that's the world in which right and wrong looks like good and evil. That's why the tree is named a tree of knowledge of good and evil, because it transforms your understanding of right and wrong into good and evil, which means that before eating from the tree, in the pre-tree world, right and wrong did not look like good and evil. Instead, it looked like something else. The question is, what is that something else? So here's Maimonides' answer. Maimonides says before eating from the tree, we wouldn't have thought of right and wrong as good and evil. Instead, we would think of right and wrong as truth and falsehood. That's right. We wouldn't have been speaking of good and evil at all. Those words would have seemed strange to us to use those kinds of words to talk about morality. Instead, the much more natural thing would be to talk about moral decisions in terms of what is true and what is false. Now, I can hear you thinking, this is ridiculous. This makes no sense. He's got it wrong. That's not what true means, and it's not what false means. Nowadays, if we think about what kinds of things are true or what kinds of things are false, we make a little list for ourselves. 2 plus 2 equals 4. What would you say? Would you say that this is good? Or would you say that this is true? Well, most of us would say that that's true. Okay? So let's try another one. The Pythagorean theorem. We'd also say Pythagorean theorem, true, right? We wouldn't call that good. Robbing a bank. Well, would you say that that is bad, or would you say that that is false? Well, most of us would call that bad, right? Cheating on a test, we'd call that bad. We wouldn't call it false. Having a little old lady across the street, we would call that, we'd call that good. We wouldn't call that true. But Maimonides argues that these kinds of intuitions that we only have them because we are living in the post-tree world. If we had been living in the pre-tree world, then we wouldn't think about these things this way. We would think that robbing a bank is false. We would say that cheating on a test is also false. We would say that helping a little old lady across the street, that's true. And these kinds of words, good and bad, would have seemed foreign to us. Now the question is, what does that even mean? How do we crawl back into that pre-tree world and understand a world in which our intuitions would be completely different, where it would seem natural to use these kinds of words of false and true to talk about these kinds of things, which we call really moral decisions? So what I want to do here with you now is to try to do what we can to understand that. To a certain extent, it's almost impossible, because what we're trying to do is understand a world that we're not in. So it requires putting on different glasses. So let's try and put those glasses on and see what we make of this. So to get a sense of what Maimonides, or in Hebrew the Rambam, is talking about, let's just try to talk again about these two different words here, truth and falsehood on the one hand and good and evil on the other. Let's start with truth and falsehood, and I think we'll get a sense of what it might mean to apply truth and falsehood to the realm of moral judgments. Okay, let's talk about that. So when we talk about something as true, what do we really mean? In other words, can we define true in terms other than truth? Whenever you define something, you have to define it in, using a word that is different than the word itself. How would you define the word true? So I think most of us would have a sense that truth and falsehood is really about something being real and about non-real. Right? When something is real, we call it true. When something is not real, it's false. It evaporates, it dissipates. Those ideas, real and non-real, are very objective kinds of things. It's about sort of discerning objective reality. So if we're going to take truth and falsehood and talk about those things in the moral realm, take them out of the realm of things like mathematics and bring them into the realm of moral judgments, what I think that would mean is that in essence we're making objective judgments. We're making judgments about what is objectively right and wrong, and we're trying to discern what's kind of real and what is non-real. It's almost like when we get it right, when we make a correct moral judgment, we align ourselves with what is real in the world in sort of a moral sense, and that when we don't, we're choosing something which is non-real. We're kind of missing the mark. And you can get a sense of this in a very common sense kind of way in terms of even nowadays how we use these words and how the Bible uses these words. Let's again talk about the word truth. So interestingly, you ever hear the phrase, an arrow found its mark, the arrow was true to its mark. So when an arrow strikes true, so an arrow hits the mark. So in a certain way, you might say that every moral judgment is an attempt to hit the mark. There is something there which is true, which is, this target. There's some sort of target there, which is this thing out there that I'm trying to reach. And whenever I make decisions, I try to align myself with what is right, what's really out there. And if I miss, I hit somewhere out here, so I've missed the mark. And interestingly enough, if you look at the biblical word for sin, you'll find the biblical sin is the word chet. That's transliterated. If you would put it into Hebrew, it would look something like this. And those of you who speak Hebrew, so you're familiar with the word chet as sin, but actually it means something besides sin also. If you look at, say, the book of Judges, so you have this phrase over here in the book of Judges 20:17, story about this almost civil war that takes place towards the end of the book of Judges between Benjamin and the other tribes of Israel. And it says there were these sharpshooters who would be able to sling stones and be able to hit a mark within like a hair's breadth. Velo yechata. Now, those of you who know Hebrew, again, here's that word chet, right? You can even see it. Well, this is hard to see, but if you could see what this word is, that is chet. It's the same word over here as this. But the word chet over here means that they wouldn't miss. So again, the sense is that the arrow runs true when it hits its course, and it misses. It sins when it doesn't hit the mark. So what sin really is about, if you really think about it deeply, is not hellfire and God punishing you and putting you in hell. If there is any of that, that's just a byproduct. What it really is about is trying to reach for something objective, God's will, trying to understand what God's will is, if you put it in a religious sense, and if you understand it and get there, so you hit the mark, and if you didn't understand it and you missed the mark, so that's what a sin is. And so you really see here how the ideas of truth and falsehood really resonate with seeing morality as an attempt to line myself up with what is objectively true and what is objectively false. On the other hand, when we think of the words good and bad, these words are a little bit more slippery when we use these words for right and wrong. What else do good and bad mean besides morally praiseworthy and morally reprehensible? If you think about it, there's another meaning to that word. Because whereas truth and falsehood connote something which is real and not real, good and bad does have that moral sense of morally right and wrong, but it doesn't just have a moral sense. There's another meaning, another definition. If this is definition 1, there's a definition 2. And definition 2 is kind of what I like and what I don't like, what's desirable and what's not desirable. When something is desirable, we say that's good. When something is undesirable, we call it bad. And to be very commonsensical about this, you might just take, children. A child might say, I love pizza. Pizza is good. And another child might say, I hate broccoli. Broccoli is bad. Well, when they say that, they aren't making moral judgments about pizza and broccoli. They're telling you what they like and what they don't like. Right? This child likes pizza. She's very happy about pizza. This child hates broccoli. She's very upset about broccoli. Really what she's saying is the broccoli doesn't conform with my desires, and the pizza conforms with my desires. In a certain way, you might say, when you talk about good and bad in this way, when this child says that this pizza is good and this child says that the broccoli is bad, they're really telling you less about the pizza and the broccoli than they are about themselves, about their state of mind. Right? This girl is happy. She's telling you about herself when she says the pizza is good. It's very slippery. She's not actually describing the pizza. She's describing herself. And same thing of this girl. This girl is not really describing the objective qualities of the broccoli. She's describing how she feels when, even though what she's saying is the broccoli is bad, what she really means is she doesn't like the broccoli. And it's that slippery quality that exists in these words good and bad. And that is the tricky part of the post-tree world. In the post-tree world, in the world of good and bad, you may think that you're making moral judgments. You for sure think you're making moral judgments. You think you're just deciding what's right and what's wrong. But there's something else at work here. There's something slippery. There's something subjective about your judgment. And there's always another possibility, which is maybe you're not really describing the world as it is, but you're describing the world as you see it. Maybe you don't really realize that, but maybe what you're really doing is you're making judgments between what you like and what you don't like. And you think you're making judgments between what's right and what's wrong in an objective sense, but your vision is clouded between what you like and what you don't like. And that's, I think, what Maimonides is talking about when he talks about the tree clouding our vision.
So I am suggesting to you that this distinction that he made about the pre-tree world and the post-tree world is applicable to this observation he's making about prophets. So let's read that paragraph again. The beginning on the top there. Let me now explain the above statement. In accordance with what we have made clear in chapter 2, virtues are either intellectual or moral. Similarly, vices are intellectual as ignorance, stupidity, and want of understanding, or they're moral as inordinate lust, pride, irascibility, anger, impudence, avarice, and many other similar defects, a list of which we have given and explained in chapter 4. Each of these defects is as a partition separating man from God the Most High. This is what the prophet meant when he said, "But your iniquities have ever made a separation between you and your God," which means that our sins, which, as we have said, are the evil iniquities, are the partitions which separate us from God. So using that distinction that Rabbi Foreman uses to, and this is again explaining another teaching of the Rambam, we would say this: the more I become attached to my desire, the more my desire has a say in how I view the world. So that I may think I'm seeing clearly, but in truth, I'm not. Because my desire is ever present when I look out at the world. So I might think when I see something and I say, oh, that's bad and that's good, that's some kind of objective measuring. But it very well might not be. It very well might be what I really mean is I like that and I don't like that. And the thing is, I can't tell when that's happening. I'm blind to when it's happening. And it's for sure happening to some degree. That's the story of eating from the tree. And eating from the tree guaranteed that we all have it to some degree, but the degree to which we latch on to the objects of our desire is going to impact the degree of clarity that we see anything, and certainly the degree to which we see God. Again, if our goal is knowledge of God and connection to God, the notion that defects in our character can keep us away from that, not just because they keep us away from pursuing it, but even as we pursue it, they keep us away from understanding it or seeing it, because we have this kind of clouded vision, which the cloudiness is coming from the fact that we are what we're calling our iniquities, the connection that we're making to objects of our desire. Okay, I'm going to.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
It seems that the Rambam's hinting at a subjective theory of ethics. Because
subjective theory of what?
Of ethics, of morality. Because the way we're talking about his position, we're making the think, well, a lot of, like good and bad. I like something, I don't like something, or something's right or something's wrong. But I take a common moral precept. It's wrong to inflict harm on a person without his consent. Okay. Now, that's true. And I don't think I'm making something, and I'm no way being confused by what I like or don't like. But if you're going to say that, this lack of clarity, then it opens the door for skepticism.
Well, again,
those things are forbidden.
Again, you could make the statement, but let's say you come to an actual ethical challenge, let's say torture of prisoners at Guantanamo or at some other jail. So I think that's where the problem is going to come in, not with the original statement of principle, but the application in real time in where he goes out. I mean, Rabbi Foreman spends more time working on that. I mean, it's obviously based on that Rambam. He spends more time developing the definitions so that they're a little bit sharper. But I think that's where it comes up. You may have principles. I think Ken Spero. Do you remember watching him do that? I think he had this book World Perfect or something. And I think it's from that book. But he does a presentation where he takes almost any ethic that has been important, let's say like causing suffering to children, or let's say you take something like that, and he'll show that maybe during this time, this was considered inviolable by the majority of human beings, but then he shows that there was another time when clearly that wasn't the ethic, because when they would conquer other people, they would kill all the children, and they would do it brutally or something like that. And so it could be like that you could state, I mean, that's even a little different than what I was saying at first, but it could be you could make a statement and everybody would agree on it as a moral principle. But then the question is, when it comes to acting on it in real time, how do you see the real question? So it could be you're somebody who would say, I would never torture, but then you find yourself in a situation where you're torturing. And if somebody asked you, why have you changed your mind? You'd be confused, and you might say something like, well, I never understood the stakes, that we're up against, or things like that. In other words, when you get in, this is where the confusion starts to take over and the subjectivity emerges, I would say. But even that thing of is it true that you could make a statement that everybody would agree on for all time? Ken Spero seemed to.
Everybody doesn't have to agree on it. A lot, at one time, a great majority thought that the Earth was flat. The cognoscenti, of course, do different, but it's not a. It's not moral, but it's the same thing.
Right. I mean, somebody might argue that it's not possible to right for us to come up with something that everybody would agree on. You're saying you don't have to agree on it. Let's say you arrived at it in some kind of objective way, or somebody else arrived at it, you're accepting it. But then I still think that when it comes time to putting it into practice, that's where the subjectivity is going to emerge. That's where it's going to become unclear.
Okay, you might well be right. That may be, yeah. That may be
Also, because it doesn't mean
explanation.
you're for sure going to be wrong. It just means we have this kind of, I don't know if you call it blind spot when it comes to that subjective voice, what he's calling our personal likes, or he labels as desire. So I can't always tell, am I saying this because it's the right thing, or just because, because I like it, I want to do it.
Well, just in closing, they say roughly a third of practicing philosophers believe that when you say something is good or something is bad, that literally means I like it or I don't like it, or even worse, it just means or ugh. So
Yeah. Okie dokie. I look forward to working on this tomorrow.